The scene at Buckingham Palace that morning was bustling, with excited crowds packed tightly on the sidewalk, eagerly awaiting the changing of the guard's ceremony. Flashing cameras, smiles, and laughter filled the air, creating a festive atmosphere. But amidst the lively crowd, one figure stood out like a dark, defiant shadow: Jake Weston. A 32-year-old man, tall and muscular with broad shoulders and powerful strides, he was the center of attention. Known as a famous wrestler in the U.S., Jake carried an air of overconfidence, his tough exterior resembling a character straight out of an action movie. In particular, the black t-shirt emblazoned with the words "No Rules" emphasized his arrogance and pride. Since his arrival, Jake began to harass those around him, mocking and ridiculing the stoic guards standing at attention to protect the palace. He scoffed at the soldiers, calling them statues or emotionless robots. His taunts not only undermined the peaceful atmosphere, but also irritated those around him. Not stopping there, Jake grew even more arrogant as he noticed the crowd starting to focus on him. He moved closer and challenged one of the guards. Henry Smith, a 28-year-old guard, stood firm like a rock, his gaze unwavering despite Jake's continued barrage of provocations. "Are you just going to stand there like a puppet?" Jake shouted, causing the crowd to laugh. But then, as the tension in the air mounted, Jake could no longer restrain himself. He moved closer, his hand tightening into a fist as if preparing to strike. Shouts erupted from the crowd, but Jake continued to mock. In a sudden, powerful, and calculated wrestling move, Henry was thrown off his position, his body crashing to the ground like a block of stone. The space fell silent, filled only with heavy breathing and the frantic screams of the crowd. A powerful, unexpected blow that no one saw coming, and the atmosphere shifted entirely. From this point, the story would no longer be just a mindless provocation, but a tense struggle between justice and recklessness. After Jake Weston's powerful throw, the atmosphere around them suddenly became still. Henry Smith, the 28-year-old royal guard, remained motionless despite being thrown forcefully to the ground. At that moment, all eyes were on him. The anxious gasps from the crowd echoed, and phones began recording this tense moment. The fall not only caused Henry pain, but also put him in an extremely serious situation. However, what earned him the admiration of the crowd was the absolute composure he displayed. The onlookers had expected Henry to collapse immediately, but no! He slowly rose to his feet, every movement deliberate and strong, showing no sign of weakness. Meanwhile, Jake stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes alight with a sense of victory. He exhaled, thinking he had achieved his goal, the attention and delighted laughter from the crowd. But when he saw Henry still standing, his eyes began to show confusion. Henry's movements, though pained, did nothing to diminish Jake's smugness. The tension in the air continued to rise. Those around them seemed unable to believe what they were witnessing. They saw a royal guard not only endure but also maintain his composure and dignity in the face of provocation from a brutish aggressor. Jake began to feel the tension building. He no longer smiled in triumph. Taking slow, deliberate steps toward Henry, his eyes locked on his opponent, his hands clenched. "This isn't over, guard," Jake said, his voice filled with challenge, but now there was no longer any confidence, only impatience. The crowd started murmuring, a wave of disapproval rising, but Jake didn't stop. He crossed the line of respect and was determined to escalate the situation further. Suddenly, with a surge of anger, he charged, preparing to strike once more. The crowd screamed, chaos erupted. But Henry stood firm, his eyes never leaving Jake, as if he had been prepared for this moment. Jake couldn't stop. He lunged, his hands tightening around Henry's body. This time, everything happened quickly, in a tense, eerie silence. Henry couldn't break free. The feeling of helplessness and pain began to overwhelm him. But he remained silent, offering no resistance. Henry's calmness only deepened the crowd's respect for him. Meanwhile, Jake, having achieved what he thought he wanted, could not escape the unforeseen consequences of his actions. The scene quickly descended into chaos as Jake Weston took another step forward, deciding not only to threaten but to actually act. With arrogant self-satisfaction, he charged at Henry Smith, the royal guard, this time not just a provocation, but a violent challenge. Those around immediately recognized what was about to happen, and fearful screams erupted from the crowd. "Stop! Police! Call the police!" But the cries came too late. Jake, with his muscular build and superior strength, showed no hesitation. He charged, closing the distance to Henry in an instant, then bent down, using his immense power to lift the guard as if he were a puppet. The gasps of the crowd mixed together, as no one could believe their eyes when they saw Henry thrown into the air and slammed violently to the ground. A resounding crash echoed, as if the entire Buckingham Square had been shaken. Everything seemed to stop for a moment, the crowd frozen, watching a royal guard in his bright red uniform lying motionless on the ground. Henry, with a sharp pain in his shoulder and a dizzying feeling, struggled to sit up, but his hands trembled, unable to grasp the ground. The pain from the injury spread, making him uncomfortable. However, even in such a critical situation, his gaze never left Jake. Henry's resilience and composure only intensified the tension in the air. The crowd could barely utter a word, their panic growing louder. A woman standing nearby screamed, "What did he do? Call the police now!" Meanwhile, Jake, convinced of his victory, stood there, chest heaving, arms raised in celebration, as though he had just defeated an opponent in his match. He laughed loudly, looking around as if expecting admiration from the crowd, but instead, he was met with glares of anger and fear. Not a single person in the crowd was smiling. A shout rang out from the crowd as a group of royal police officers appeared from behind, quickly surrounding Jake and his friends. It was at this moment that Jake began to realize he was no longer the center of attention. Neither the crowd nor the chaos could salvage his impulsiveness. In that instant, Jake understood that this was just the beginning, not only an assault but the end of his arrogance and recklessness. The scene was no longer a typical event. Jake Weston, standing firm on his feet, looked around with a defiant gaze. The crowd, once admiring and curious, now only held anger and fear in their eyes. The shouting grew louder, people demanding immediate action from the police. But Jake still hadn't realized the severity of his actions. He stood there, smug, believing he had won. "See? This is how a real man does it," Jake laughed, his voice full of arrogance, oblivious to how everything was turning against him. Just as the shouts intensified, a group of royal police officers appeared, storming in like a hurricane, surrounding Jake in tense moments. Henry, despite struggling with the excruciating pain from his serious injuries, remained standing, his gaze determined. He didn't let his condition interfere with justice. Though the pain, especially in his broken left arm, was unbearable, Henry kept his back straight, showing resilience and respect for his role. The steps of the police officers drew nearer, and Henry's calmness was a stark contrast to Jake's panic. At that moment, everything happened in a flash. One officer approached Jake, quickly grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. Jake let out a painful shout, but the officer's strength and decisiveness overpowered him. "No more games, buddy," one officer said in a stern voice, while another pushed Jake to the ground, kneeling on him and starting to handcuff him. The officers acted so swiftly that Jake had no chance to react. His expression shifted from smugness to confusion. "Don't make this worse," one of the officers warned. The crowd began to clap, excited by the swift punishment of the attacker. The applause echoed as Jake was dragged away, and the attention of the crowd shifted to Henry. Royal nurses and doctors quickly approached, taking him off the scene. But despite his serious injuries, Henry showed no signs of weakness. He walked resolutely, despite the pain, while some people in the crowd began shouting, "You're a hero!" A true symbol of discipline and honor. The scene was shocking, a perfect contrast to Jake's initial arrogant demeanor. As the ambulance rolled away, carrying Henry, the tension still hung in the air, and the bells of Buckingham Palace rang out, reminding everyone of the respect for traditions, no matter the difficult circumstances. But for Jake, he was no longer the center of attention. Now, he was the image of a criminal, handcuffed and silently following behind, with nothing left to do but accept the consequences of his arrogance. As Jake Weston was led away by the police, a wave of anger from the crowd continued to rise. Shouts and criticisms from all directions hit his ears like crashing waves. The royal police escorted Jake through the crowd, making him feel an overwhelming sense of humiliation. The glares of contempt from those who had witnessed the event pierced his self-esteem like sharp knives. "Get out of here, thug!" one person shouted, while others pointed at him and shook their heads in disgust. The police force guided Jake to the patrol car, and the sound of applause filled the air, not for him, but for Henry Smith. The Royal Guard, despite his serious injuries, stood tall, his gaze resolute and his face filled with determination. The crowd couldn't help but notice Henry's admirable resilience. Phones continued recording the moment, but this time it wasn't Jake's provocation, it was Henry's calmness and inner strength. He had become a symbol of patience and power in the eyes of everyone. As Jake was shoved into the car, he clearly felt the weight of his failure. All the attention from the crowd had shifted entirely away from him and toward Henry. The police carried out their duty, continuing to escort Jake, but all he could hear was the silence around him, as if the entire world had turned its back on him. "He will pay for what he's done," one officer said calmly, looking at Jake with an unsympathetic gaze. The truth was now undeniable. As for Henry, though in pain and exhausted, he stood firm. Looking at him, one couldn't see disappointment or weariness, only the image of a steadfast soldier, embodying the most sacred ideals in the hearts of the people. When the ambulance finally left, carrying him to the hospital, peace settled over the square, but one thing was certain, Jake would never forget this moment. The image of him being arrested and the honor given to Henry would serve as an unforgettable reminder. The criticism of him would linger, like a stain on his life. And the applause for Henry wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new symbol, a reminder of the importance of respect, discipline, and honor. When Jake Weston was taken to the police station, his self-esteem was completely crushed. The sound of applause still echoed in his mind, like the ringing of bells signaling an inevitable defeat. Videos of Jake's assault quickly spread on social media, and within hours, images of him being arrested and jailed became a hot topic across the media. What a disgrace, he thought, unable to comprehend why people saw him as an enemy rather than as a hero who liked to have fun. But while he was drowning in shame, another event occurred that made everything even more tense. Henry Smith, despite still being treated in the hospital, had quickly become a symbol of resilience and honor. His story, about respect and dignity in the face of a tense confrontation, spread rapidly. Some began to compare him to true heroes, an unyielding figure who stood firm even in the most difficult of situations. But it wasn't just the public and his admirers. People in the military, government officials, and even the royal family recognized Henry's excellence. They sent letters of praise, commending his spirit and strength. Certainly, no one could forget the moment when he held his ground despite being attacked, showing no sign of weakness. The press, after covering the incident, continuously condemned Jake's actions. People no longer saw him as a funny character, but as someone who had violated the basic respect owed to a national symbol. International media also didn't overlook it, making things even worse for Jake. Attack on a national symbol of Britain became the headline in major newspapers, and social media buzzed with relentless criticism. Videos of the incident attracted millions of views, and demands began to grow stronger. Jake had to be held accountable not only for his actions, but also for the grave disrespect he had shown to the country's traditions. As the trial approached, Jake began to realize more clearly than ever that his actions had not only destroyed his career, but had also placed him face to face with severe legal consequences. In stark contrast to Henry's composure, Jake was now a mere shadow of his former self, tortured by the foolish decisions that had led his life to a dead end. Jake Weston, who once stood in the ring under the dazzling lights and the cheers of thousands of spectators, now sat silently in the courtroom, his empty eyes fixed on his tightly shackled hands. The trial did not last long, as the evidence against him was irrefutable. Video footage captured him ruthlessly taking down Henry Smith, witness testimonies corroborated the brutal attack, and medical reports detailed the severe injuries Henry had sustained. There was no longer a stage to showcase his skills, no more crowds to chant his name, only the cold, indifferent silence of justice remained. In stark contrast to Jake's downfall, Henry Smith, who had endured provocation and a sudden assault, became the center of admiration. Though his wounds still throbbed with pain, he appeared before the public with unwavering composure, his sharp gaze reflecting the resilience of a soldier who never surrenders. Major newspapers featured his image prominently. He was no longer just a royal guard, but a symbol of honor and loyalty. The commendation ceremony at the military barracks was filled with solemn reverence. High-ranking officers and citizens who had witnessed the incident gathered to pay tribute to him. As the Medal of Honor was placed upon Henry's chest, the applause was endless. The general's voice rang with pride. Your loyalty, determination, and indomitable spirit are a source of pride for us all. In that moment, Henry was no longer just a guard. He had become a symbol of perseverance and unbreakable dignity. Meanwhile, Jake, once filled with arrogance, was now left with nothing but belated regret. Each passing day in prison felt like a psychological sentence, forcing him to confront his own mistakes. The scornful gazes of those around him, the harsh criticism flooding social media, all of it buried the once glorious image he had built. One became a legend through resilience, the other was forgotten due to arrogance. Their story became a powerful lesson for those who disregard honor and tradition, a reminder that true strength does not lie in muscles or pride, but in patience and human dignity. Jake Weston, once a star in the ring with glorious victories, was now nothing more than a faded shadow behind prison bars. The dazzling lights of his past had been replaced by cold, unfeeling walls and the indifference of those who once cheered his name. When the final verdict was announced, his face turned pale, his vacant eyes scanning the courtroom, where countless cameras were pointed at him like invisible daggers. Jake was no longer the strong man standing victorious in the ring. He was now a convicted criminal, mocked, scorned, and mercilessly condemned by the public. In the early days of his imprisonment, Jake struggled to accept reality. He constantly justified himself, convincing himself that this was just a temporary performance, that the outside world was still waiting for his return. But as time passed, the truth became increasingly bitter. The doors of opportunity had slammed shut, sponsors had turned their backs on him, and fans abandoned him without hesitation. The videos of his brutal attack on Henry continued to spread across news outlets and social media, transforming him from a champion into a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to disregard honor and tradition. Day by day, Jake began to feel the harshness of prison life. There were no more rounds of applause, no roaring crowds, only scrutinizing eyes and the cold isolation of disgrace. The other inmates did not admire him. In fact, they looked down on the arrogance he once carried. Jake had believed that physical strength could help him stand tall anywhere, but now it could not erase the label of failure that clung to him. Meanwhile, in the outside world, Henry Smith, the resilient royal guard, was celebrated more than ever. His image, standing strong through adversity, enduring pain without faltering, had become a symbol of honor and loyalty. Major newspapers praised him, while Jake, the The man who had once mocked and underestimated Henry had become nothing more than a stain in history. As his final days in prison approached, Jake looked back on his life with bitterness. From a hero to a disgrace, all because of one moment of arrogance, one mistake that could never be undone. When he finally stepped out of prison in his inmate's uniform, his eyes empty, he realized he had nothing left, no fame, no career, no self-respect. Only the loneliness of a man who had lost everything.